I am speaking with our state senator, Bruce Tarr. Hi, Bruce. How are you?
Hi, Heather. I'm doing great, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. You've had a really, really busy week. Let's start right off with this new push to amend the state's voting laws.
Well, sure. And it's an important topic, Heather. And in fact, one of the most important things that we can do in the legislature is make sure that we have rules that try to get as many people as possible to vote and be able to vote, and at the same time maintain the security and integrity of the voting system so that we can all continue to have trust in it. And those things came center stage this week in the legislature, particularly on Wednesday in the Senate, where a bill came up that was largely born out of the pandemic and some of the things that we did during the state of emergency to make sure that people could vote. And that involved things like mail-in voting and being able to secure a ballot by virtue of an application that was mailed. But these bills are comprehensive, and the one that we took up was fairly broad. And I'm particularly pleased that when there were things that we didn't necessarily like as a Senate Republican caucus in the bill that was released from the Senate Committee on Ways and Means, we produced an alternative, and that's why I use the word bills rather than bill. And those are the things that were on the table this week.
So could you tell us a little bit about what the minority offered as a bill?
Sure.
The bill that was passed?
Sure. So there were a couple of objectives that we started out with, and I've already mentioned the broad themes. We wanted to make sure that as many people as possible, and we'd like to have it be 100% of eligible voters, are able to participate in our elections. And when you look at the numbers that we've seen over the last couple of decades, we don't always see robust participation. And so we were looking to increase participation and also increase the security of elections. And so one of the things that we would do in our bill is change the current deadline for registering to vote. Currently, it stands at 20 days before an election. But we have heard from a lot of folks that in many cases, people don't start paying attention to those kind of things until an election draws closer. And so we would change that deadline from 20 days to 5 days, which would give them 15 more days, would allow them to register much closer to the election, but at the same time, give our clerks and our Secretary of State ample opportunity to prepare an accurate voting list. And that's something that's very important to us. And we want to make sure, again, that we maximize participation and we make sure that the system has integrity. And that idea falls into both of those categories. In addition to that, something that was common to both bills was this notion of being able to use mail-in voting a little bit more broadly. Now, before the pandemic, we would refer to mail-in voting as absentee voting, which is allowed in Massachusetts, and it's allowed under the Constitution for 3 reasons. Number one, if you are, due to your employment circumstances, unable to vote. Number two, vote in person. Number two, if you are going to be physically out of the state. And then in 1917, the Constitution was amended to say that if your religious beliefs prevent you from voting on that particular election day, you can also vote by absentee ballot. What we would like to do is to say that folks will be able to absentee ballot vote without any of those reasons, for any reason whatsoever. And that actually is something upon which there is agreement between both parties in the Senate. The challenge is, I mentioned the Constitution, and the Constitution doesn't necessarily permit us to do that which we would like to do that I just described. And so there's an issue here that I really think needs to be addressed. I did raise it during debate on the Senate floor, and I didn't raise it as a means of trying to undercut the other bill, the alternative bill, because we both bills contain that provision or that type of provision. But I believe that's something that we're going to have to revisit in the future as we move forward. But we also, in the alternative bill, look at it going even further. Rather than waiting for folks to come to register, we would direct the Secretary of State to conduct targeted voter registration programs in communities that have relatively low rates of registration. And those programs could be not only done by the Secretary of State, but they could actually also be in the form of grants to communities, so communities themselves could increase their efforts to register voters. One thing, Heather, we've heard about is that sometimes people don't know how they're registered or if they're registered. So what we would require is that 30 days before any election, the Secretary of State would establish a hotline, a toll-free hotline, so people could know their registration status and they could ask. And if there's an issue, there's plenty of time before the election to be able to address that issue. Similarly, we would require the Secretary of State to notify everyone in Massachusetts once a year of how they are registered, so that if there's an issue, they can deal with that issue. Again, the idea is being able to give people access to good information and being able to have time to act on that good information. There's a provision that was in the bill that was offered by the Senate Ways and Means Committee that would require our clerks to post notice of where polling places are 7 days before an election. We think it should actually be 14 days before an election. So we believe that we offered a comprehensive bill that goes further than the main bill, but does so without necessarily hitting some of the pitfalls that the main bill would fall up against. And so you don't always win every day on Beacon Hill, but
let's just make this clear. You just described the Republican bill, the bill
that's
that
correct.
the party put together.
That's correct.
Not the bill that the Senate passed on Wednesday.
That's correct.
And the main difference is that you contest that voter registration should stop 5 days ahead of the election.
That's correct. And also in our version of the bill, the Secretary of State does not mail ballot applications, but what the Secretary of State does do is use a variety of techniques to make sure people know their registration status. And this is a point that I missed in describing the minority party bill. And by the way, Heather, I hate to use the terms Republican bill and Democrat bill because we work very hard in the Senate not to use that labeling and use those stereotypes. In this particular case, it happens to be accurate. But the additional thing that we would do is cause the Secretary of State to create a website where folks could register if they submit the proper information, so that they don't even have to go to a city clerk's office. They don't even have to operate through the mail. They could do it electronically, again, by submitting the proper information to the Secretary of State. So we believe that the alternative that we put on the table, again, avoids some things that have been problematic, like trying to compose voter lists on the same day that you are registering people to vote, and trying to count votes on the same day that you might be registering to people to vote, but also goes much, much further in trying to be proactive in helping people make sure they know their voter status and they do get registered to vote.
But both bills, both the minority party bill and the bill that was passed by the Senate on Wednesday, bring up issues of the state constitution. They both, right? So you want to talk about that?
No, there's no question about that. And in fact, it's very interesting that Senator Barry Feingold, my good friend who chairs the Election Laws Committee from Andover, who put together the majority bill, actually in 2013 was a co-sponsor of a proposed constitutional amendment to allow the issue of no excuse, essentially no excuse absentee balloting to happen. So back then, folks were aware that this could be an issue.
So what happened back then? What happened in
2013? So it actually got preliminary approval, but did not advance to the ballot because, as you know, a constitutional amendment has to go through 2 successive legislatures and then go to the ballot for the public to vote on. It made it a first step, but it didn't make it the rest of the way. And interestingly enough, at the beginning of this legislative session, a number of members of the House of Representatives filed a similar measure because the problem has not been addressed or the issue has not been addressed. Now, there is a vehicle to be able to look at this, and that would be for the legislature to send a question to the Supreme Judicial Court. And the way that our Constitution operates is that the legislature doesn't have to guess as to whether what it's doing is constitutional. There are mechanisms by which, if we have what's called a grave question or a solemn occasion, which is in this case legislation that is being contemplated, if we want to ask the Supreme Judicial Court, would this be constitutional? we have a mechanism to do that. And that may be something that you yet see come in this debate. But I also would point out, Heather, that the debate's got a long way to go because the House will be taking up this bill at some point in the future, and there's no guarantee that they'll take up the same bill. They could pass a different bill, as they did in the past, and then we might wind up in a conference committee yet again.
Well, there is a lot there, and it's just more proof that you had a really busy week. So thank you very much for that. And you also were talking about hens this week.
So Heather, before we move on, I do just want to thank the many folks that have written into us from different perspectives about these bills. And that's always something that's important to us. And I want to thank folks that took the time to do that and who I hope will continue to do that. But yes, turning to another subject, and I'm trying to think of what they used to say on the old Benny Hill comedy series. I think you may remember what they'd say, and now for something completely different. Right. and so now for something completely different, we turn to the subject of eggs and hens and a potential shortage. Many folks may remember that in 2016, there was a ballot initiative and the question passed relative to the sizes of cages that hens could be kept in. And believe at the same time, or maybe at a different time, there was another ballot question about so-called gestation crates for cows and pigs. But with regard to the hens, the industry has said to us that it would be very difficult for them to comply with the provisions as written and that passed as a ballot initiative. And for those that know me, I'm very hesitant to change something that the voters approved themselves and told us, here's what we want. But in this case, the advocates for the ballot question and the industry came forward and said, not only is this not workable, it's also not a good idea. And because industry practices have changed, and so the bill needs to change. And so what the new bill essentially says is rather than have a specific requirement for the floor space of a cage where a hen might be kept, that you can also have somewhat of an open aviary where you might have limited floor space, but it's open vertically for a very large amount of area. So the new bill says you either have to have increased space on the floor or you have to have this open aviary situation. And we're told that if we do not do that, that on January 1st, when the regulations that stem from the law are due to kick in, we could have a very serious egg shortage in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And that's not just because our own egg producers could not comply with the provisions of the law, but it's also because egg producers throughout the country could not comply with the provisions of the law. And the way the law is written, you cannot import an egg that is grown under the illegal conditions that the bill identifies. And so if we do not do this, we couldn't import our way out of this problem. And so there's a lot of concern. I had a meeting with a lot of the grocers and retailers, as well as the Greater Boston Food Bank, to talk about the fact that if we don't take action, there could be a very serious consumer egg shortage. And eggs are a really important part of the nutritional picture of folks in New England, and I would suggest everywhere. So we're working on that. The Senate had back in June adopted revisions to the bill. This week, the House adopted its own version of changes to the bill, and the two are different. And so now we may have to have a conference committee. It's too soon to tell that yet, but we do have to reconcile those differences. And many, many people are watching this with the hope that we can get a final version to the governor's desk before too long.
So I believe you said that even the people who were in support of the ballot initiative understand that this is a problem.
Right? They have been advocating for these changes. They reached a stage of negotiation with the egg producers that yielded an agreement. And is that agreement that we're trying to reflect in the legislation.
Well, that's really interesting. And every consumer will be watching this bill very closely, I think.
There's no doubt about it. And I started to see this issue reported in the press a little bit this week. And I suspect as time goes by and until we have a solution, we'll see it reported more and more.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Heather. And it's always great to be on with you and talk a little bit about what's happening on Beacon Hill.